and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for your fantastic speech. I agree with you that women should not shut up and that we need to make sure that we bring the faith discussion back into it, especially here in UN Week. We're running the Missing MDG, essentially to call upon government and religious leaders to ensure that religion is not used to excuse conflict, particularly in areas where we have the most pressing development issues. So I'm going to throw my questions over to Ajarat just to ask you some questions on your thoughts on faith and development and government.
So basically, I mean, one of the questions that we had, one of the issues that we're dealing with is the whole voices of faith and conflict, people that are actually marginalized by this conflict. It was whether religion is actually being used, you know what I mean, as an excuse for religious conflict. What are your things, for example, on the issue of just, you know, for example, Israel, Palestine, not necessarily specifically, but where, you know, developmental, where a lot of money is being pumped into fighting wars as opposed to stopping developmental issues.
Well, interesting that you mentioned the Palestinians and the Israelis, because this is a perfect example of what you're talking about. So we have come to a point in the development of our species, and the Israelis and the Palestinians are a perfect example, where, as Einstein said, the problems of the world will not be solved on the level of thinking you created it, on a personality level. If you look at someone like the Israelis and the Palestinians, you can see many analogous situations where on a personality level, peace will not come. There's been too much pain. There's been too much horror. There's been too much on each side to forgive. And so when you just deal on the personality level and try to, quote-unquote, broker a peace deal, it exudes on a certain level because the heart is filled up. This is where not organized religion with its doctrine, its dogma comes in, but this is where a deeper spiritual understanding comes in, and this is how it works. Because I'm not an Israeli and because I'm not a Palestinian, even though I can understand the resentment on both sides, I don't in my heart feel it to the same extent because it's not my babies who've been killed. Hello, right? Okay. So on a level of meditation and prayer, these different levels of the mind, now we've already seen this, the most prestigious academic institutions have now statistically verified the efficacy of forgiveness, love, prayer, meditation, helping people to, it actually literally benefits the immune system in physical healing. People who are prayed for get out of intensive care units faster. There's an actual effect, an actual physical effect on the immune system when people employ spiritual practices. Martin Luther King said about Mahatma Gandhi that he was the first person in human history to take the love ethic beyond personal interaction and to apply it to a broad-scale social force for good. So we need to take the tenets of holistic healing and apply them to healing political and social relationships as well. So if we now know that there are psychological, emotional, and spiritual elements to healing the body, we now need to realize that same holistic model, there are emotional, psychological, and spiritual issues to healing the world. On a metaphysical level, all minds are joined. We know that when a butterfly flaps its wings on the South Pole, it literally affects the wind curtains in the North Pole. As we pray, as you meditate, you could meditate for 5 minutes every morning, and you see a place where you envision an Israeli citizen, but you see a light emanating from their heart that extends past the body. And then you, in the other side of your mind, visualize the Palestinian citizen, and you visualize a light emerging from the center of their heart, and you see the light extend past the body, and I want to get rid of my water bottle here so I can show you. So then with my mind's eye, I see the light from that extends past the flesh of the Israelis merge with the light that extends from the Palestinians. That level of reality, which my physical eye does not see, because my physical eye only sees the mortal self, the physical self, but my inner eye sees it, the light of who we all are, and I stay there for 5 minutes. Are you with me? Yes. That synapse is not easy for the Palestinian and the Israelis necessarily because of places in the mortal that it's understandably. But you and I can hold that. And what is happening on a spiritual level is that as I see that reality, I am literally increasing the capacity within the Palestinians and the Israelis for that synapse to be forged. Now, when we first started talking about these spiritual effects, love, forgiveness, prayer, meditation, when it came to healing the body, the traditional allopathic medical community tapped us on the head, very patronizing, very condescending. Well, it's nice, dear, if you can help them cope. Those days are over. The oncologist today is likely to be the first person to tell you to get yourself over to one of those spiritual support groups. What's happening in politics today is analogous to what was happening, particularly with the AIDS crisis back in the 1980s, when the allopathic medical community finally got to the point where they realized at that time that they had played all their cards, they didn't have any more cards to play, and they looked at people who were doing the spiritual work and basically said, what have you got? And their arrogance was diminished. That is what is happening today. World leaders know that the old problem-solving repertoire is not working. They pretend sometimes that they know what to do because unlike the medical community that has an ethical responsibility to tell you when there's nothing more I can do, politicians pretend they know what to do even when they think, well, I got to tell you something. But behind closed doors, they know we need some more ideas here. We need some more cards. And those ideas are the 21st century beliefs. What's happening with the MDG is even though the goal is a 21st century sensibility, the strategies too often are not 21st century. That's why the whole digital social networking thing is so important. But it's not just our strategy that needs to be updated. Our conversation needs to be updated. And it is women. We're used to being patronized and condescended to when we talk about genuinely new ideas. But you know what? You just keep talking. And ultimately, the people who are condescending and patronizing about it realize that they're the ones being left out in the cold because everybody else is having this conversation too, right? And also, I don't know if you heard me, I was mentioning earlier about a sociological study that's been done, which I find fascinating. If a woman starts talking like this, or about anything about putting the moral issue first, the humanitarian issue first, the spiritual issue first, taking care of our natural habitat, taking care of our children, we used to be shut up more easily when somebody would roll their eyes. We call this soft, fuzzy brain thinking light. Those days, that's what we have to challenge. And what we know sociologically is if even one other person says, well, actually, I think that too, the entire system changes. Martin Luther King would say that a more life-sustaining idea carries cosmic companionship. And I think we have to think more in terms of what is true than what is feasible. And that is the new strategy because that gives you moral authority.
So what advice?
And it is that quiet, I'm sorry,
no, that's
it is
okay.
that quiet moral authority that will ultimately carry the day.
What advice would you give the aspiring leaders of tomorrow in terms of actually looking at that moral imperative and, what advice would you give to us, under 25s, under 30s, really trying to change the conversation?
Young women, I don't know how many of you have had babies. I'm sure some of you will have babies. So those of you who have know that nature has made you so that your breast expresses milk. Your body has what is necessary to feed the young. Every person has wisdom in the same way. And there is an internal teacher, there is an internal guidance system by whatever name we call it. And as we reflect, as we are contemplative and prayerful and meditative and whatever the practice is by which we find our own, that would be my quote-unquote advice. Listen to that voice within you.
Fabulous.
And to no other.
Thank you very much, Marianne.
What can the faith community do to be better understood and to maybe be taken more seriously without going to the lowest common denominator and just speaking the truth so eloquently the way you have?
Too often, the so-called faith community speaks with anything but faith-based community. They have their own posturing, their own political agenda, their own dogma and doctrine that they're trying to impose on the rest of the world. That's old. It needs to go into the dustbin of history. The faith community needs to speak from what it says and believes. That's what gives, I don't care whether you're a minister, a priest, a rabbi, or a completely secular person. If you speak from your heart, you'll be heard now. If you don't, you won't. And there are many secular voices speaking from the heart and with deep moral authority, which is the essence of faith. And there are people speaking from the so-called faith community who need to get over themselves, who are not speaking from the heart. And they're not going to be heard. Now, when everybody, and that's where no women can participate, that's important part, when we all settle down and settle in and speak from the truth of our deep humanity, then what order, we need to realize that all of these categories are artificial. That human beings, whether they're in the White House or a slum, whether they're in the faith community or they're in the humanitarian development aid community, we're all human beings, and we all have to find that place of our deep humanity, and that's the voice that will be heard and will carry the day, and that's the voice that will be able to, that is the bridge. Other people hear you on the level you speak from. If you're speaking from only above the neck, you're going to have a hard time because only above the neck and other people are going to hear you. And there is no bridge there that's stable and fundamental and strong. But if you speak from your heart and the language of God, God himself would not have us use the word God, the word with great communication. Even the word faith is a little, maybe not the best word to use. The heart, our love for our children, future generations. I love deep humanity. When Muhammad Yunus said to me, because we're human. What does it mean to be a human being? Do human beings behave this way? Would tigers or lions or hyenas or bears allow their young to be imperiled this way? No, they wouldn't. This is an evolutionary imperative. We are arguably not moving in a direction, in an evolutionary sense, that is well adapted for the survival of our species. We fight too much, and we are systematically destroying our own habitat. You don't have to bring in any sort of fancy words. Those are just facts. And it's more about our courage, the courage we need to just speak what we already think. And that, I think, for women, you know what to say, you're just scared to say it. So whatever you're already feeling and thinking and that you say late at night to your girlfriends on the phone, that's it. Speak out loud.
Just one question. My point was, have any
sort of advocacy there. And I was kind of interested in sort of, I guess the Millennium Development Goals sort of don't necessarily explicitly kind of address the peace issue, but right now this week is also sort of International Peace Day. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit sort of the connections that maybe should be made or the connections that have been made sort of between peace and the Millennium Development Goals.
Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the difference between negative peace and positive peace. He said negative peace is where there's no outright conflict, but there's underlying tension and anxiety. He said positive peace can only be built on brotherhood and justice. So this idea of what so often we call peace in this world, it really just means the cessation of violence. But the roots of peace are still there, how people feel inside themselves, the desperation of people. And anytime you have large groups of desperate people, you have a powder keg. So you might say we're at peace now because nobody's shooting. But once again, old think. New think is realizing that unless we deal with these causal issues of war and violence, which is large groups of desperate people, that's the powder keg. So that's the connection. This is about building the true foundations of peace. It's about justice and brotherhood, without which, at the very least, we're in a cessation of conflict for a while. We're in a pause in conflict, a never true cessation of conflict. We'll never transcend conflict. We'll just put it on pause button as long as we do not address the huge amounts of unnecessary human suffering that forms the petri dish out of which so many of these group pathologies emerge. Desperate people are far more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic ideologies. Thank you. Thank you. The person I'm supposed to speak to right now is you. How do I know? It's a self-worth. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that's the answer, okay? That's number one. Number two, like I was saying earlier, if you have a Facebook page, you have a media platform. Anybody has a media platform now. That's what's so amazing. That's what's so